Hello and welcome to Ullapool. Well, sadly, not Ullapool, but my house. Um, I'm going to guess that, like you and me and everybody else, we've been looking forward to over the last year, focusing throughout this pandemic, this terrible pandemic year, on the second weekend of May, and that pivotal time for all of us, the Ullapool Book Festival. And sadly, both last year and this year, that hasn't happened, and that's why I'm not there. I have to say, as this welcome address from the honorary president of the Ullapool Book Festival, I have to say my honorary presidency must be the most troubled and troublesome in the entire UBF history. However, I think that even given the fact that we can't be together this year in Ullapool, doesn't mean to say that we're not going to have a fantastic celebration of books and reading and a great Ullapool Book Festival. I mean, in a sense, writers and readers weren't really supposed to be together. I mean, it's all about it. What's so fascinating that we can read people from many, many miles away and many, many centuries apart and still feel a connection. Right now, I'm working on a text in Satire of the Three Estates, written 470 years ago, and yet I feel this connection with David Lindsay. But in Ullapool, we do love being together. We do love walking around the streets of Ullapool and going down to the Cayley Place and of course the Scones and chatting about who we've listened to and what we've heard. And in a sense, I think that can keep on going. And in one sense, better even than usual. This is going to be another great Ullapool Book Festival. Joan and the team have gone out their way to make it as Ullapool as possible, and it's as rich and as deep and as varied as it always is. There's Gaelic poetry, there's music, there's poetry from Ayrshire, there's crime from today, the here and now, and from the Victorian era. There's travel writing, there's political writing, there's history. There's all those conversations that we have every year in Ullapool about who we are, where we've been and where we're going. And this year, although we don't have that one special weekend in the second weekend of May, we are going to be together every Wednesday night, right through spring, right through summer into August. So in one sense, that's really, really special. And I'm kind of so looking forward to all that. And this is quite a special spring and summer, hopefully at the end of which the world will look in a more recognisable shape and we can look forward to 2022.
Welcome to another event at the 2021 Book Festival in Ullapool, and we're talking to you this afternoon from the parlour in the Cayley Place in Ullapool, and I can't think of anywhere else that would be better to celebrate this year's event. My name is Ruth Wishart, and it's my very great pleasure to be interviewing a man about whom we should all be very grateful. His roles as investigations editor at Open Democracy and as chair of the group of independent journalists who comprise The Ferret means that he spends a lot of his time uncovering things many people would rather stay well hidden. His latest dive into the murky world of contemporary politics has revealed some very alarming facts about the tactics and funding deployed during the recent Scottish general election, and we're going to chat about all of that in a minute. His most extensive research, however, lies between the covers of this remarkable book, which I'm just going to give you. Please go and buy. It's fabby. This remarkable book, it's called Democracy for Sale, and it traces a path through the dark money and dirty deals which have polluted UK politics more generally, and he introduces us to an extremely unsavoury caste list whose mission is to corrupt democracy in pursuit of radical right-wing agendas. It's a tour de force, and looking at how there's a constant digital manipulation of domestic events in a world where the regulations and the oversight still dwell in an analogue age. He's a Glasgow-based Irishman with a global interest in shining a light into some very murky waters, and his name is Peter Gagan. Hi, Peter. Welcome.
Hi, Ruth. Thank you very much for having me. And I can't think of anywhere I'd rather be than here in the parlour at the Cayley Place in Ullapool. So, it's fantastic. I feel very blessed to be here. So, thank you very much.
Well, nothing to do with me, but I'm because I was equally happy. Nobody had to ask us twice to come here. Now, let's just go back to the Scottish general election, because it's not that long ago. So what I'm trying to get a handle on is how it was influenced by a number of unionist groups trying to game the system, as it were. And so tell us who they are and who funds them.
Yeah, well, basically, I've been looking at this kind of almost digital disinformation, and the way politics has been done online. So the way people are able to buy ads and to try and influence politics. And my book really looks at all that.
Yeah.
But I started looking at, just in the run-up to the Scottish Parliament elections in May 2021, I started asking, well, what's going on? What kind of ads have been bought? So I started looking at Facebook, and I started looking to see who's buying ads. And I found that in the last few days, the kind of crucial few days before the vote, before people went to the polls, a number of unionist groups were starting to push tactical voting, spending thousands, tens and tens of thousands of pounds on ads. Flouting rules are supposed to be in place to stop this happening. And what you're able to see is, some of these groups, you don't even really know who are behind them, because they're, groups like Turning Point, which is this pro-Trump student group, but for some reason
it's a UK
group, and somehow was spending almost £4,000 in the last few days of the campaign trying to push unionist tactical voting, but also other groups which are quite familiar to me. There's one group called Young Unionists, another called, which was Think Scotland, which is run by Brian Monteith, which is a former Brexit Party member of the European Parliament, also a former Conservative MSP. And what was really striking to me is a lot of these groups actually were very familiar to me, because I'd actually already written about a lot of these people in my book, because they've been doing the same thing ahead of the 2019 general election.
Yeah.
But what they were able to do was take, as has been the case so much, able to take advantage of lax regulation to buy loads of ads, not put no details about who's buying the ads on them, or even if they do, which they're supposed to do, it's still very clear that they're not the people buying the ads. So one quick example was a group called Businesses for the Union. That sounds like a good thing. Businesses who want to support the union. They spent over £10,000 on ads in the run-up to the Scottish election. All the ads were bought by a man called Matthew Kilcoyne. Matthew Kilcoyne is the deputy director of the Adam Smith Institute, right-wing think tank who I write about in my book too. There's no suggestion that he spent £10,000 of his own money on it. Where did the money come from? He doesn't have to tell us, and we never will know.
And the Adam Smith Institute certainly isn't going to tell us.
No, not a word.
But what I don't understand about all of this, among many things I don't understand about all of this, is that there are laws in place, admittedly not fit for purpose in many cases, but these groups should have told us who they were, and they should have told us how much they were spending, and they should have told us where that money came from, and they should have declared all of these things before the election took place, and that doesn't seem to have happened.
No, so what happened for the Scottish election, for the first time, people who are campaigning had to do what was called put imprints on ads. So you might notice, anybody watching might notice, if you get kind of a leaflet through your door saying for the election, has to have a little imprint that says you paid for it. In Britain, for anywhere else in Britain except for Scotland, you don't have to do that. So you can advertise online, you don't have to say where the money comes from. What they did for the Scottish election for the first time was these ads all had to have imprints. I noticed lots of these ads didn't have imprints, and I wrote about it, and I also contacted the Electoral Commission, which is the regulator. These are the people who are supposed to ensure our elections run smoothly. And the Electoral Commission kind of said, you're right there, they should have that. And I asked, are you going to investigate? You're going to do something about it? Oh, we might, probably not though, really. And this is it, because all of these people, the people who I wrote about in the Scottish election recently, the kind of, as I say, they're people who are very familiar to me. One of the reasons I got interested in this, it didn't take me a long time to investigate it.
Because the same cast list is doing the same thing in the same elections everywhere.
Everywhere. And they know, because they don't even get a rap on the knuckles, Ruth. And that's the issue.
And the fines involved, I know from your book, Peter, the fines involved are very small. There's something like 20 grand. Now, if you're spending tens of thousands, in America, hundreds of thousands of pounds, then that literally is a slap in the wrist.
Well, that's it. The maximum fine for breaking electoral law is £20,000. But actually, it's worth remembering, it's a sliding scale. So that's for the worst instances. So we might talk later about Vote Leave. Vote Leave got fined £20,000 for a very egregious breach of electoral law. If you're a small campaign like these unionist campaigns, you're probably talking £500 or £600.
Yes.
And for the big money men who are behind this, and we know there's big money behind this.
That's stuff they've got in the back pocket.
Actually, to be honest, they already factor it in.
Yeah, one other thing I want to draw out from you about this recent election in Scotland is that it's quite obvious from the way things panned out that there was a shed load of tactical voting going on. I mean, a whole lot of seats where, my own seat, I happen to know that there was a huge number of Conservative voters suddenly discovered they loved Labour. I mean, and that wasn't just peculiar to my seat.
Yeah, so in some ways, it's not. I wasn't hugely surprised to see tactical voting because if you're on the unionist side in Scotland, you can see the SNP pretty much is the one big party on the national side. The unionist vote is split into the Conservatives, Labour, and the Liberal Democrats. And I think what we saw was in lots of different seats, if there was an incumbent unionist, they did well. So incumbent Tories did well, like Oliver Mundell really had increased his vote. Same thing happened in West Aberdeenshire. In your seat was Jackie Bailey and Dumbarton for Labour. So in some ways you could see it, but what I was really struck with was in the run-up to the election, there was very little conversation across parties about tactical voting. They weren't saying to vote tactically. And quietly, especially, I think it's worth remembering, this campaign was unlike most in that we have a pandemic. So people weren't going out as they normally would. You say you're a Labour person in the borders, maybe you would put the union first. So you might say on the doorstep, vote. If you don't want to vote for me, vote for the unionists. Yeah. That wasn't happening. So all this messaging was happening online, but it wasn't happening from political parties.
But it was happening in Facebook ads from these small groups.
These small groups who aren't and the big thing with this as well is if you're a political party, so say you're the Labour Party and you try to quietly buy Facebook ads around tactical voting, that would get into the papers, the record would run it. It could even be a front page story. What these guys are doing is all
under the radar.
All under the radar, and you get these anonymous people who've never heard of, and often without even saying any names. So this campaign, Young Unionists, spent around £20,000, £5,000 in the last week, which in Scotland is a lot of money.
It is,
but so we don't know who these people are. So there's no hue and cry about it in the same way
because
there would.
Because it's not as if it's an MSP doing it or paying for it or writing a cheque for it. It's somebody we've never heard of, so it doesn't matter in theory. But I mean, one of the things that intrigues me is that in your book, you made it quite clear that these tactics had already been used and used very successfully in the Brexit campaign, in the Vote Leave campaign. And now you would think, would you not, that any sentient politician would have twigged that and would be trying to do something similar on the other side of the coin?
Well, you see, I guess that's one side of it is, can you try and go to the other side? But like the reality is, it's funny, but it seems to be a politically split way of working, especially when it comes to online. What I mean by that is that it seems to be the right that's much better at using the internet to do this. Partly it's to do with emotions. I write in my book about the power. Hate and anger are very powerful emotions, and they tend to be easier to stoke than like kind of empathy and kind of communitarianism. And so what you see is there's an entire chapter in my book about the Brexit Party, which I really enjoyed writing because I thought they were fascinating. This party didn't exist. It only was formed in kind of March.
Standing start.
From March 2019, didn't exist. June 2019, 30% topped the poll in the European election. And now it doesn't exist again. So I was very interested in the Brexit Party. But the reason I bring it up is that the Brexit Party were incredibly successful with online messaging. So they spent a lot of money online, but they were very successful. Change UK, if people can remember Change UK, this party that came out of like Rump, Labour and Tories, they spent a lot of money online, very unsuccessfully. But one thing that's very interesting is that the average Change UK Facebook state update had something like 75 characters. The average Brexit Party had 19 characters.
Yeah.
And it's the messaging, it's the way, it's a mix of things. It's a reason why I think.
But it's sort of this get Brexit done, build back better. It's sort of these three-word slogans that they're so good at.
Very much so. And that's why I think rather than trying to beat people at this, you're much better off thinking about how do we regulate this and make it bring it transparent. I think that's my big issue with this, because I think and this is my concern, if you look at, we're speaking just a few days after the Queen's speech came out in which the government said that they're going to bring in mandatory voter ID, something which the Electoral Commission says there's no need for. We have no evidence.
Because they said it was on the back of voter fraud. There is zero evidence of voter fraud. It's obviously just a way of suppressing the vote. and suppressing the vote of people who are not likely to vote for that particular party.
Completely, and it's quite clear that that's the agenda behind it. But at the same time, the government is doing nothing about all the things that are in my book, which I think is so interesting. So it really tells you. It says, and I ended up for my sins on Radio Scotland arguing with a man for the Daily Telegraph about this, and he was saying
That's
that
a bit a waste of your time.
it really was a waste of my time. It made me think of that famous George Bernard Shaw maxim about why you shouldn't wrestle with a pig, because you get dirty, the pig enjoys it. And he was saying, we have to stop this, because and I said there's no evidence. Well, even if there's no evidence, there could be in the future. But
this is happening
right now. We're doing nothing about it.
Exactly. Yeah. So the only electoral reform they want is to stop electors getting to the polls if they're the wrong electors, basically. Now, there's another aspect of this which was absolutely chilling in the Scottish election, and this wasn't, I don't think, piloted elsewhere in the UK, but it was very successful because if we everybody will remember that in the Scottish general election, the party sheet was. I actually measured it. It was just short of 2 feet long, and it had 19 parties or individuals.
Well, in my one in Glasgow, there was 22 on the list, so I went from different places.
Well, arithmetic was never my strong suit.
Yeah.
But anyway, however many, I think I had 19 in mind. But the point of it is that it was done kind of alphabetically. So there was a party that popped up of whom I'd never heard, which was calling itself Independent Green Voice. And of course, as soon as you see green, you think cuddly, especially because it's got a wee leaf beside it, letting you think that it is all environmentally cuddly. But hey, it's not. So tell us a bit about them.
Yeah, so I was very interested in this. As you said, I went to my polling station and I'd heard about this beforehand. And I noticed halfway down my peach list ballot this Independent Green Voice and said vote for organic. But actually, Independent Green Voice had only a handful of candidates across Scotland, a number of which were former BNP people, British National Party. One was somebody who'd been accused of Holocaust denial, a seriously unsavoury bunch of people. But they polled very significantly. They polled over 2,000 votes in Glasgow, more than 1,600 in the south of Scotland, and in both places, the Greens, the Scottish Greens, which came very towards the end of your list.
Because they start with S.
Because they start with S. Very narrowly, in both cases, very narrowly, missed out in seats. In the south of Scotland, if the Greens had got 10% of those independent Green votes,
of these fake Green votes,
they would have won a seat.
Home and dry.
Yeah, and so I think it's a huge issue. We saw a number, we actually saw in Scotland, in Glasgow as well, this thing called the Scottish Liberal Party, which involved people who were giving Nazi salutes and wearing the Star of David. And so again...
And who had nothing whatsoever to do with the Gems.
And we were seeing this gaming of the system, especially on the list. We're seeing these fake parties, essentially, I think, trying to hoodwink voters. I think it's very concerning.
But this probably makes me sound ludicrously naive, Peter, but if a party pops up like the Independent Green Voice, and if it doesn't really have any pedigree, except for, a scatter of activity elsewhere, if it doesn't have any pedigree and it's a new voice and it changes its logo just weeks before the election, wouldn't the Electoral Commission have something to say about it in an ideal world?
Well, the thing is, there's hundreds of political parties registered, and lots of them are in abeyance. They just sit there in abeyance. And Independent Green Voice is an example of this. So it was registered back in 2003. It ran in the Scottish elections that year and polled the sum total of 0.1% of the vote. Didn't even run in 2016 and then was kind of recreated. So for the Electoral Commission, for the regulators, that's a difficult thing because it's very hard to get rid of a political party. They almost have to cut them, which we can see the democratic argument for. But much more concerning is what you've pointed out there is the changing of their logo. Yeah. So it used to have like a strong, basically a fascist-looking fist, a big, strong fist. 2 months before this election, they changed it to a leaf. Who doesn't like a leaf? With a big capital green. So it went from this quite threatening looking logo to capital green written in capital letters and your little leaf. And who doesn't like that?
A little leaf, yeah. But there again, that's something that you would think, even if they've got lots of parties to look after, as it were, you would think that would ring some kind of warning bell.
My big issue, so I interviewed the Electoral Commission in my book. There's a senior person interviewed on the record in my book. I spoke to a lot of people off the record for my book. I continued to talk to them. I had an off the record meeting with the Electoral Commission not long ago talking about some of these issues. But the thing is, you're talking about when it comes to regulation, it comes to this, we see this across the piece, whether it's the story in many ways of Britain over the last 40 years. What we did was we privatised things, we put things out of the state, we've got semi-state bodies to regulate them, and a lot of these semi-state bodies, whether it's the Serious Fraud Office, the Financial Conduct Authority, or in this case the Electoral Commission, generally they are very, very, very adverse to acting. They will only want to. They will
poorly resourced.
Poorly resourced and have a general timidity because they're worried. So, and I can understand why.
Because they might get their money taken away if they come to the wrong conclusion.
Well, exactly. And we've already seen that the chair of the Conservative Party, Amanda Milling, has said in her submission to Parliament that we should look at abolishing the Electoral Commission.
Yeah, and so who needs regulation?
Well,
we do it very nicely without it.
So it's I actually do understand the timidity. This is the real problem for people who are trying to protect democracy, is that increasingly the odds are so stacked against you. And when it comes to, say, launching an investigation, I recently revealed in the 2019 general election, loads of these fake groups who were buying ads, the same cast of people, they bought ads, and I sent freedom of information requests, which I often do to the Electoral Commission to see what the conversation was about these. And I noticed that these people who were supposed to be completely separate were sending identical emails to the Electoral Commission. I said, look, does this not concern you?
They're obviously working from a joint script.
They're exactly, and they said we can't prove that. And I said, but the sentences are identical.
You've got the proof sitting on your desk.
Yeah, and I think there's also, when I talk to people about this, I say, there's also an issue where we almost take a courtroom burden of proof. So say you or I are on trial in a criminal case where we could end up with our liberty taken away.
Beyond reasonable doubt.
Which is reasonable in a case where your liberty, in a criminal case. Is there any sense in which people who are fiddling the election system, I think, beyond reason, you're not talking about putting them in prison. You're talking about stopping them from
doing it again.
Yeah. And does that require that same burden of proof? I don't think it should do, but it feels like regulators think like that. It has to be beyond, which is perfectly reasonable for criminal trials. But when you have these kind of bad actors who are doing the same thing over and over
again. Now that you mentioned the phrase bad actors, that brings me very swiftly to Mr. Dominic Cummings, whom you did. I mean, throughout, every time you mention Dominic Cummings in the book, you precede it with the word ruthless. Which I think tells us a lot about the character of the man. But the interesting thing about Mr. Cummings and his co-conspirator Lee Kane, who were both very active in the Brexit campaign, but they were, you would think, would you not, that an incoming Prime Minister that was worried about his probity, if I can use that in the same sentence as Boris Johnson, you would think, would you not, that these were very dodgy, bad actors to bring into your team, never mind let them in charge of the hen house.
But I guess in that instance, Dominic Cummings has a long track record. And in the book, I try and trace it. It actually goes all the way back to, and with Lee Kane as well, back to the early 2000s and the campaign against a North East Assembly in England. And
that was their practice run.
That really was. It really was. And then it was the alternative vote referendum in 2011. And it's so fascinating because I think people hadn't really seen how these ways of manipulation. So in 2003, when Dominic Cummings was running this campaign, he had all sorts of huge promises like the Brexit referendum, and he also at one stage he created an inflatable white elephant, huge big inflatable white elephant for photo opportunities, and he got two attractive young women from Durham University to burn fake £50 notes to show how much this assembly would cost. So he knew how to do this, but when he asked the question, why did Boris Johnson bring them in, I think we have to ask about the character of Mr. Johnson. Boris Johnson is a man throughout his entire political career has run roughshod over all rules. We're speaking now, I think there's...
But you should know at your age that these rules don't apply to old Etonians, Peter.
Well, indeed, I think that is exactly it. And we're seeing this now where Boris Johnson's nominally going to be investigated for various things to do with the funding of his flat. But do we think this is going to change what happens? I think that is the big problem.
Well, I mean, by the time you guys see this, we will know more about what Dominic Cummings could do to damage Boris Johnson, because he's appearing before another select committee at the end of May. But he's already, because Boris was stupid enough to tweak his tail, he's already done a fair bit of preemptive damage.
Well, yes, and this shows a lot of Boris Johnson's character as well. Yes, because we've seen a huge amount of briefing. We saw this that Boris Johnson had said that there would be bodies.
He'd rather see the bodies pile high than have another lockdown.
Yeah. And it was quite interesting. I noticed it was on the news that they were saying Boris Johnson strongly denies this, and they cut to an interview with Boris Johnson in which he was asked this. He goes, "No, I didn't say that." It looked about as strong as a thorough condemnation. It was not. And so this, he's made a very bad enemy, and clearly an enemy who's who has a lot of material on
A
him.
dangerous man. Well, that's the thing, because not only does Dominic Cummings know where the bodies are buried, but he had the spade.
Yes, indeed, he had the spade, and he still has it, and he can pull it out from his
And he doesn't
backyard.
care them just as quickly.
And he also has a hotline to the undertakers
Yes.
and the police.
Yes.
He knows this is which is very much.
Is he going to? I mean, how dangerous is he?
It depends. I guess, we're talking as well just after the result in the Hartlepool by-election, which seems to have has really buoyed Boris Johnson. I think has made it much it's kind of created a narrative on Boris Johnson. He is some electoral superhero. And so I think that
Or at least Teflon.
that these things would fall away from him. And what's interesting, Boris Johnson has announced there's going to be an inquiry into the COVID response in a way to preempt what Dominic Cummings says. But that's not
We're
going to
not
take
till next
place.
spring and
Yes.
lasting 2 years.
Yes.
And meanwhile, the fixed term election bill will have gone through, and he can just have an election at the drop of a.
That's exactly it. And what you're seeing, what we have seen, it's interesting. I think there's a reluctance in the UK to talk about how the system is being gamed and how the executive has taken on so much control. Because fundamentally in Britain, if you have somebody in charge who's willing to lie, there's nothing much. The way our politics is structured, there's not much you can do about it.
As we discovered with Mr. Trump.
Yes.
But the interesting thing about that, and it seems in my mind, there's a kind of parallel with America, and I'm not suggesting for a moment that Boris Johnson is a Donald Trump, because happily there's only one of them. But what I do see is that the way the Tea Party took over the Republican Party, so that the lunatics were in charge of the asylum, and similarly the European research groups, so far as I can detect, I've never researched anything in their puff, but they seem to have morphed into the modern Tory party.
Well, that's interesting. The European Research Group was one of the things I really wanted to look at when I was writing this book, because I decided, if for people who I can't remember exactly who they are. You probably saw them on television during those couple of years of Brexit crisis and constant votes and stuff. And you would see, I was really struck, you would see the European Research Group, which is a group of probably, 60 to 80 backbench Tory MPs. They kind of came from nowhere to be everywhere between 2017 and 2019. They even had spokespeople on different issues.
Yeah.
The Channel 4
Steve
News.
Baker and Mark Francois.
So when I went to write this book, I started and I realised no one had ever really gone into them. No one, especially one of the things I noticed, no one had ever spoken to previous members, because the European Research Group had been founded almost 20 years earlier by Daniel Hannan. And it really is remarkable when I started looking at it to see how what was a tiny fringe group where it just had quite boring conversations about
Somebody
Europe.
called them fruitcakes and.
They were called. There's been a lot of statements about them. One Tory MP said to me that they were a bunch of Trump fantasists, and what else did he say?
They've done quite well for fantasists.
They did very well. I think that was one of the things. I think it's very easy to underestimate these sort of characters. People like Steve Baker, who can seem a bit nutty. Steve Baker is a born-again Christian who loves motorbikes and skydiving and keeps a piece of silver in his pocket because he'd like to return to the gold standard someday. So they can seem really, but they can make a big difference. I think they got rid of Theresa May. If it wasn't for them, Boris Johnson wouldn't have become the Prime Minister. And I think that was one reason I really wanted to focus, was because I think it's so easy to underestimate these characters, but actually they're just like I talked about Dominic Cummings, they showed a ruthlessness. And I think that's what we've seen in British politics over the last 10 years is one side has been so much more ruthless than the other, whether it was the Brexiteers or the Eurosceptics who forced the Brexit referendum, to the European Research Group who were able to, in the kind of ashes, the post-2016 moment, with a little bit of help with some private money, a little bit of help with some dark money, were able to, didn't take a huge amount, were able to really change the conversation.
That's quite an interesting point you make there, of course, about the amount, because as we know in America, there are these super PACs, people can throw obscene amounts of money at elections, especially at local elections in America, and really game the system big time. But in Britain, it seems that you can do quite a big bang for quite a small buck.
Yeah, it's really interesting. When I started researching this was just after the Brexit referendum, I thought, look, Britain doesn't have the same problem as America. Certainly, yeah, money is important in politics, but it's not like America. The last presidential election just gone last November, that was billions, were spent on that. In contrast, the 2019 general election in Britain was a couple of $100 million. But actually, when you think about it, if you step back a little bit, and I only noticed this from starting to do research and finding out how money operates in Britain. Actually, if there's less money in the system, it can be even more influential. So, whereas in America, you might need $5 or $10 million even to get influence a state legislative election. In Britain, where political parties have to fund themselves, we're not like Europe, because that's the big difference. In Europe, most parties are funded by the state. We don't do that in Britain. So parties have to scramble around for money. So they're constantly on the hunt for cash. So it means they're far more amenable. So, for example, to give you a concrete example, people might remember there was a big scandal during the summer, the Westbury scandal, which involved Robert Jenrick, the housing minister, and he'd overturned a planning application to do a big, huge property development in the Isle of Dogs in East London, loads of flats. And the man who made the application was Richard Desmond, former proprietor of the Express, very rich man. And this overturning the decision saved Richard Desmond an estimated £40 to £50 million. So how did this happen? Well, Robert Jenrick had been sitting next to Richard Desmond at a Tory fundraiser.
But you see, the whole thing about this, without getting into a huge cast list, but the whole thing about this is that all of these things, once parties require, once any party requires a lot of external money, a lot of donors, there's an immediate and obvious conflict of interest.
Completely, but this is it. And actually, when they were asked about it, another Tory minister, not Mr. Jenrick, was asked on the radio about this. Said, "Look, is this okay that somebody can?" And it was £12,000, so it wasn't a huge amount of money to sit at this meal. This Tory minister said, "Well, anybody can go and attend Tory fundraise. If you go and buy a seat, you can also have a chat with the minister.
If you happen to have £10,000 in your back pocket."
And is that the way you want to work a system?
Yeah.
And what's interesting as well is we saw that through the summer as well. I did a lot of reporting on these COVID contracts. We saw a lot of cronyism. We saw companies who were politically connected
and no competitive tendering, about which the Conservatives used to be so hot.
Well, this is the interesting about what is Boris Johnson's party now, because it's this strange mix of the European Research Group, who are kind of radical free marketeers. They want a Singapore on Thames, but at the same time, all this kind of cronyism. So there's exactly. They used to love competitive tendering. They're not so keen on it now.
I didn't have the time or the energy or the capacity to go into all of these things as deeply as you do, Peter. But I did notice when I did a modest bit of research on the contracts that amongst the winners were a pest control company and somebody who sells sweeties, and they wouldn't have seemed the obvious candidates for protective equipment for the National Health Service.
No, and even more remarkably, the two companies you're describing there were both on what was called a VIP list.
Yes.
So this was in government, fast tracked. And if you were on this VIP list for politically connected firms, you were 10 times more likely to get a government contract. And okay, we understand it was a pandemic, but it's worth stressing, these were life-changing sums of money. Some of these companies, so for example, a Tory councillor in Stroud in the Cotswolds, he got about £400 or £500 million worth of contracts. So say on a normal contract, you might make 10%. Would you believe that man last summer, a few months after getting one of those contracts, bought himself a big, massive new £4 million house?
I saw a picture of it, yes.
Very nice it was too.
Work if you can get it. Absolutely.
But these are life-changing sums of money that were given out willy-nilly to people who were politically connected.
But the thing that concerns me among thousands of things that concern me, I'm just getting very depressed in the course of this conversation, but the thing that strikes me is that by the time all this is unpicked, there might be a different government in, there might be a different Prime Minister in, and also the public's appetite for concentration on these matters is very limited because, every day you look at news online or newspapers or whatever your bag is, and, for example, Boris Johnson's flat and who paid for what when was huge news. And then suddenly David Cameron was huge news because David Cameron had trumped him by some rather interesting lobbying. And let's just talk about that a minute, because lobbying is another way in which the democratic process is being subverted.
Yes, very much, and I think it's the level of kind of schadenfreude isn't quite the right word for it, but David Cameron's involvement in this. So David Cameron, for this long-running scandal where David Cameron has been lobbying for a now collapsed finance firm called Greensill Capital, in which he had a 1% stake because he was an advisor, which could have been worth hundreds of millions of pounds had it floated.
In addition to a salary well in excess of his Prime Ministerial one, as he said himself when he was being interviewed.
Yes, so a huge amount of money. But the great irony of this is David Cameron was a man who set himself up shortly before his election in 2010. As
That was his rallying cry, yes.
What he called the quiet word. He said,
Yeah.
I'm going to end this culture, I'm going to end lobbying. It's the next scandal waiting to happen. And it turns out he was right.
Unfortunately, he was in the middle of it.
He was the one doing the lobbying. I think you're asking about the public, and I'll go back to Cameron in a second. But what I think partly these are often quite complicated stories too. Like I was writing about Greensill for the London Review of Books recently, and it took me an entire weekend to write 2,000 words because I went and sat down and tried to get through all the information. I spoke to all the journalists who were doing the work on it too. But the nature of the corporate world is actually quite nutty and difficult. You can hear my accent. I'm from Ireland. I grew up in the 80s in Ireland where there was a culture of brown envelopes, money in brown envelopes to do stuff. That
wasn't just an Irish thing.
It was true indeed, and it happened elsewhere. That's quite easy for people to understand. So something like Greensill, so basically the long and the short of Greensill is that when David Cameron was the Prime Minister, Lex Greensill, this big, tall, rangy Australian...
Had a desk in the cabinet office.
Yeah, and had his own little business card and was made a Crown representative, who was able to work on government business. And he was basically selling if you talk to people who know about these things, there's a thing called supply financing. And basically, if you talk to people who know about these things, they say, look, it's kind of balance sheet manipulation. It's very like what happened before the financial crisis. It's not some great
Sounds a bit like a political Ponzi scheme.
Well, there's an element of it. And then when Cameron got out of office, so when you leave office, if you go and take a job like this, like a lobbyist, you've got in the first 2 years out of office, you have to register with a thing called the Advisory Committee on Business Appointments, which sounds very grand, ACABA. They're a very toothless organisation. But you have to register if you do it in the first 2 years. David Cameron signed up as a lobbyist for Greensill exactly 2 years and 1 month after leaving office, so we didn't even really know about this, and we wouldn't know. And then it transpires.
If they hadn't gone belly up, we wouldn't.
We wouldn't. That's exactly it. We only know about this because the company went belly up, and while the company was going belly up, David Cameron was lobbying his socks off. He was ringing Rishi Sunak, the Chancellor. He was ringing Michael Gove. He was having meetings with people who used to work for him.
But isn't there something deeply unsavoury about the fact that somebody who was Prime Minister of the country, the top job in the country, somebody like that could use his ex-colleagues' contacts, private phone lines, to try and enrich himself? I mean, that's just, well, I'm not going to use what I think it is, but you get my drift.
It is, but the problem I think in some ways is that this has actually been allowed to go on for so long. This is the most egregious example, but it's not surprising because he's the best connected. Yeah. But there's so many former government people who go into private jobs. I actually myself and my colleagues Open Democracy recently revealed, because there's now a new independent advisor on ministerial standards. A post had been left empty for 8 months. For 8 months. After the previous holder, Sir Alex Allen, left because Priti Patel, the Home Secretary, had been found to have bullied staff, but there was
broke the ministerial guidelines and was told that's all right.
He was told, and because the only person there was no full investigation, because the only person who can launch an actual investigation for a breach of ministerial code is the Prime Minister. So
he's not going to launch anything that's going to damage himself.
No, and he's now been replaced by a man called Lord Gett. And what's interesting about him is, unlike all previous independent advisors of ministerial standards, this man is not a career civil servant. So he's got lots of outside interests, including being an advisor to BAE Systems, the arms manufacturer, which he still is. So it's not hard. Conflict of interests are now not only baked into the system, they're getting worse. So we're seeing this. All these people, what hats are these people wearing at different times?
But there is, there's many aspects of this that we haven't got time to go into, donors winding up in the Lords and all of that, and the level of donor you have to be, depending whether you get a knighthood or depending whether you get a peerage or whatever. But forgetting all that for a moment, there is just the same, you mentioned the phrase revolving door, and the Ministry of Defence, civil servants who've been in charge of negotiating contracts for these departments then wind up on the boards of the people with whom. So of course they know exactly what to say, and they know they've got very hot information for their new employer. Now there ought to be a law against it.
Well, there should, in the same way you would think that there'd be a law against the Chancellor, the former Chancellor, which happened last year, Sajid Javid, only out of office barely 6 months, goes and gets a job for about £150,000 a year with a bank. while keeping his.
Not even enough to refurbish a flat in Downing
Well,
Street.
indeed, but you would, and I think this fundamentally is the problem, because it's not just that they know the system. You have to ask, well, if they're expecting to get this kind of payday at the end of it, how's it influencing their decisions in office?
Yeah. The more you're talking, and the more deeply we go into all of this undergrowth, this very nasty undergrowth, it's almost impossible to see how anybody could clear it up, even if they wanted to, and nobody seems to want to anyway. But even let's suppose they did. So let's suppose we've got a phalanx of knights in white chargers coming in to clear the whole place up. It's almost too endemic now to think you could do that.
I think it's almost two ways of looking at it. I try a little bit towards the end of my book to talk about it. I think one way there's almost like a, without getting too airy-fairy, there's a technocratic way and there's a philosophical question. And what I mean by that, the technocratic thing is, what laws and rules could we change to make the system better? And actually there's loads of them. I know it can feel like that, Ruth. It can feel like this is so endemic, what are we going to do with it? But actually, lots of countries have good laws on this. So it's not, we don't have to reinvent the wheel. There's a lot of stuff we could just
Give me an
pick up.
example of who.
Well, so for example, Ireland has just put, I know Ireland very well, but Ireland has just published a new heads of a bill to set up its own independent electoral commission, having not done so before. It's very good. It's got great stuff on online advertising, for example. We could just adopt it wholesale.
Take that off the shelf.
Take it off the shelf. So lobbying, for example, there's loads of great people who I know very well. People like organisations like Transparency International, Spotlight on Corruption. They're treasure troves of how do you do this well.
Yeah.
So it's not as if there doesn't exist.
But we do like the motivation.
That's the problem, and that's where the philosophical bit comes in. You need there's a kind of motivation aspect which happens, even amongst opposition parties. A lot of this is the kind of stuff people have a tendency to say warm words about in opposition, and then once they get into power, they find this could be a little bit tricky for us. So take one example: freedom of information, which is an act that's very close to my heart. I do a lot of work with, but that allows any citizen to ask for any information created about anything created by a public body. If it's been paid by the taxpayer, you should get to know about it. The system is broken fundamentally. It doesn't. We've never seen. There's never been less positive requests for FOIs than there is now, and it's at its worst in central government. So that tells you, okay, even though the law exists, there's a cultural problem. There's a big, deep-seated cultural problem. Opposition parties will go, hell for leather, this is terrible, we must do something about it. But when they get into power, they find they might be less keen on this because it's going to give them grief. Well,
let's look at this in both sides of the border. Judging by Hartlepool and everything else, it doesn't look as if Keir Starmer's going to be measuring the curtains in Downing Street anytime soon. But
or find him wherever he might find even John Lewis if he has to. If he can't,
but yes, indeed, having had that. Anyway, let's not go there. But the point I'm labouring to make here is that even if I'm not holding my breath for there to be a Labour government down south, but if there were a Labour government elected to Westminster, you would think that a former Director of Public Prosecutions might be your very man to enact something useful.
Yeah, and it's interesting because this is the one area where Labour actually have been very, very proactive. Because in general, Labour seems to have been very reactive, and there's a lot of issues Labour don't want to touch. They seem to think there's something in this, and they have been they've been talking about setting up an independent ethics commission. They have been taking soundings on this. Rachel Reeves, who was the Shadow Cabinet Secretary, so Michael Gove's shadow, who's now become the Shadow Chancellor just recently after the debacle in Hartlepool. So Labour has been very vocal on this, but in some ways, we've got two issues. One is the issue I spoke about opposition parties.
Once they get into power.
Exactly. And the other is actually just the state of the polls in Britain and the likelihood of a Labour government at this time. This time before the next appearance of Halley's Comet actually seems like quite unlikely.
Well, let's switch the spotlight back to Scotland then, which is where we started, because the Scottish situation is not healthy either. Because I am. It's hardly a secret that I'm pro-independence, but I recognise with what's left of the rational half of my brain that it's very, very unhealthy for there to be a gap, such a big gap between the ruling party and the opposition parties. There ought to be more significant opposition in Scotland. So look into your crystal ball for Scotland. Well,
this is what we've seen actually remarkably in Britain, I think, across the piece, is that we even saw a little element in Wales that all UK party politics is gone. We have no parties anymore who have an all UK focus. The Labour Party used to be that party. They're not anymore. They're the third party in Scotland. They've got one MP. They're out of the picture. And we've got parties in Westminster and in Edinburgh who are, rule all this away. It's almost impossible at the moment to see a time in which the SNP doesn't win the next, because, if you look at it, unless there's a referendum, especially, it's impossible to see where an alternative government could come from. And I think there's a real problem, there's genuine problems. It's like how our party systems work is the idea that there's going to be replenishment by periods of opposition. There's a reason why we have our democratic politics is almost set up like this. And we're seeing, actually, in some ways, we're seeing in other countries too, a kind of sclerosis is happening, where you're getting single party dominance. You're getting what happens, say, for example, in Germany, you even though it's always a multi-party system, you end up with the same two parties in power. So in Germany,
and the same chancellor for a long time, who fortunately was quite good at the job.
Very good at the job, but it means that there's a sense in which seeing democratic change becomes much harder. What's really interesting, we go back. I mentioned Scotland in a sec too, but what you're even seeing in England, interestingly, is a party that stays in power while almost creating different versions of itself in power. The David Cameron Party of 2010 is completely different, light and day, to the Boris Johnson Conservative Party of 2021, yet there's still this huge big power shift. We're not seeing the same extreme in Scotland, but I do think there has to be a concern where you can't see where an opposition party might come from, and the opposition's power to hold the government to account. And I think partly it's because we are stuck in the constitutional question. And I know, the opposition parties will do the whole, we need to think beyond the constitution. But the reality is, and we get fixated on polls as well. Does a poll show support for independence up or down? What I always come back to is, almost exactly 10 years ago, ahead of the 2011 Holyrood election where the SNP won a majority, if you said then, right, in 10 years' time, almost every poll on Scottish independence will be 50-50, no one would have believed you. That would not have been the thing. And we underestimate just what a radical change our politics has taken because we're living through it. And I think that's a big part of it.
Indulge me for a moment, though, because I am looking at, Anna Sarwar, by general consent, had a reasonably good election campaign. He managed to raise his own profile quite substantially in quite a short period of time. However, he and his party have set their face against any constitutional change. And as I say, indulge me, my theory is that the Labour Party in Scotland's path back to any kind of muscular opposition has to be through them thinking the constitutional issue in a different way.
I think it's an interesting point. I've always been fascinated by Welsh Labour, actually. I think Welsh Labour are a very interesting party. And I remember about 10 years ago being at a dinner in Cardiff where Carwyn Jones, the former Welsh First Minister, spoke. And he gave such a nationalist speech. I thought it was really interesting. It was before the Scottish independence election, we knew he was on the cards. And it was very interesting because he was basically saying it was a very nationalist unionist speech in a way that Scottish Labour hasn't been able to do for a long time. It did, I think, at one stage too, but it stopped doing it because it had this real flank where the SNP was almost taking its clothes and taking its mantle. And I think the success of Welsh Labour is fascinating because it shows how a party in a system where there isn't the same pressure around independence is able to be very Welsh. Mark Drakeford does a very good distinctiveness story, and it's very electorally positive.
He also said, just the other day, if there were, and there's no suggestion that there is going to be anytime soon, but if there were a majority opinion democratically expressed in favour of Welsh independence, then he would be for it. I don't mean for it, but would agree that it was the outcome.
And so I think their success and the Welsh Labour's ability to buck the trend, I think, is all to do with that, because they're able to be seen as like Wales as the people are speaking up for Wales, and they know that's what matters. I think the big problem is, remember Joanne Lamont saying about the branch office, and those kind of comments they cut, because actually they weren't just off. They were comments that a politician I'd say will after go, I wish I hadn't said it. But they cut through because they actually spoke to something. And I think I don't know what the real challenge and the difficulty for Labour is, what stories they're able to say, because the space is quite truncated too. The social democratic space is one that's occupied by a lot of parties. It's in some ways there's echoes of the same problems Labour have outside of Scotland, that they're seeing all these other parties flanking around them, the Greens, in Scotland the SNP. There's a lot of other parties competing for the same space when it comes to policy ideas. And the problem as well for them is that a lot of the people who are in favour of these policies when it comes to the constitution have a different view to Labour. So it's really, I look at it and go, I know what you mean about Anna Sarwar's performance, and there was a lot of media applauded, but the reality is their vote went down and their number of seats went down, and they're now solidly.
And they're still the third party.
Oh, very good, solidly.
I mean, you were talking about 10 years ago, 20 years ago, it would be unimaginable to think that Scottish Labour would be in this situation.
I don't, but even if you think about it, I was just reading the most recent issue of New Statesman. You look back, it is worth remembering. 6 years ago, we were actually, almost exactly 6 years ago, we were going to the 2015 general election. Labour was defending 41 Scottish seats out of 59.
Well, of course, that happens, and it happens very suddenly, doesn't it? As it did with the Tories in Canada, you suddenly just get people fall off a cliff edge, and you haven't even noticed that they've got 1 foot over the edge. However, I want to finish because we're probably running out of time here, Peter. I want to try and, with difficulty, draw all these strands together and look ahead to, let's suppose, for the sake of argument, there is another referendum. Do you anticipate that exactly the same tactics will be used by all of these small unionist arms, campaign groups, to put together an anti-independence campaign?
I think it's going to be I think the one thing I will say is it's going to be very different to the 2014 referendum. I was just saying to you last night, Ruth, that the first time I stayed in this lovely hotel in the Katy Place was about a week before the 2014 referendum. I was on my way to Lewis to do some reporting. And, I'm not, there was lots of people with different experiences of that referendum, but the one thing that was, I think, a big factor of it was that it felt like it was a very Scottish event. And the money that was coming in, even to around Scottish campaigning, a lot of it was raised. There was Scottish Conservatives put a lot of money into it, but, Better Together campaign was still headed up by Labour. It felt like there wasn't a big UK-wide kind of lens on it. There wasn't the kind of machinations we see now. I think it's very clear it will be very, very different next time around, if and when there's another referendum.
In what regard?
I think you're going to see a big kind of UK involvement. You're going to see, and in ways I think are going to be quite potentially very nefarious. I think you're going to see a lot of the same tactics being used. So back in 2014, during the referendum, there was Facebook advertising and online advertising was in its infancy. The SNP actually in many ways was much smarter at it than the Better Together campaign. A lot of the money that was going around was, either from big donors, some key big donors, the SNP, a lot of grassroots money, and Better Together was fundraising too and doing quite successfully, again with some big donors, some grassroots money. I think there's much more scope for what we call this kind of third-party campaigning, this kind of almost gonzo campaigning, pushing out real disinformation. Not just pushing out like kind of talking points, but pushing out, basically what we would call lies.
The Scottish equivalent of £350,000 per week for the NHS.
Completely. I think we're going to see a lot more, I think, like involvement of, we used that phrase before, it's not my favourite one, but bad actors. We're going to see people who will do whatever it takes. People like the Dominic Cummings of this world. There's a new playbook. The playbook didn't exist in 2014 for how to pollute a political process. And I think that playbook really exists now.
So bits are going to be off.
I think so, and especially it was interesting. So the Scottish Parliament has passed legislation for if there's another referendum, which has got some really good stuff around electoral politics. So they're going to raise the maximum fine from that party £20,000 to £500,000, but they're only going to be able to regulate money that's coming out of Scotland.
Yeah,
I think there's
if it comes from elsewhere.
Completely. The government's already set up a union unit. So, we see people like Andrew Neil are clearly involved behind the scenes and, various, looks like a form of political campaigning. I think that's going to ratchet up massively. And as we can see, I do really worry about the architecture that we have in Scotland to look after us, because the problem is, exactly like I say in my book, it took me years to peel back the onion to find out what had happened. This could be so long after the fact before you find out what's happening.
And by that time, as we say in Glasgow, the game's a bogey.
Indeed, exactly.
Okay, Peter Geoghegan, that was just terrific. Thank you so much. But I want to say to everybody who was watching this today, this book is, frankly, it's a bit depressing because it tells you chapter and verse exactly how you can manipulate democracy to your own ends, and it's an absolutely fascinating read. I warmly recommend it, and thank you so much, Peter Geoghegan.
Thank you very much. One last thing to say is if you buy the book, you will see a picture of me at the back of it, in which I look slightly different to now. So if you want to see a before and after picture, the book will do that for you.
That's before he became the wild man of whatever it is, or the wild man of these days, Peter. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Ruth. Thank you for having me.
on the edge of the west. Beneath the wilds of the Phanis, the Jiri, Bengola, Ullapool, Kuridin Sanctuary.
Where the skies rise further, where the heather scores the west, Summer Isles, Hebrides.
These houses painted white, a metropolis whose streets you can count on your fingers, and the pier, its tongue stuck out, looking salt from the air.
Here are friendly, welcoming people. Fish suppers, a ferry black and white, flapping flag, silver sparkle, coconut broom.
Here, it's the scale of what blows through you as the wind burls the islands, sieving winter's thoughts from our heads.
And all along Market Street, the bloom of cherry blossom, making a Japan of Ullapool.